Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my third trip to Asia in the last 2 months. Our company has been working out here since 1993. We're involved in law enforcement issues out here, working with gaming regulators and working with financial institutions. And we do take some private sector clients when there's not a conflict of interest. So our perspective is more from the gaming regulatory and law enforcement side. So today we're going to primarily talk about online gaming and some of the online gaming policy and the economics of online gaming, the changing nature of online gaming. It's a huge business that's growing by leaps and bounds, not only here in Asia, but in Europe, in the Caribbean, the US, and Africa, and elsewhere. Models for operations and regulations, and some of the key regulatory concerns which governments are beginning to address and which you're going to be hearing a lot more about over the coming years, meaning beneficial ownership, who owns these companies, who controls these companies. AML issues is going to continue to be a major issue. It's a major issue everywhere in the world. Asia is no different in that sense than any other continent or any other area of the world. Asia online gaming, the POGOs in the Philippines, and hopefully, we're going to move quickly, but hopefully there'll be some time for questions. There is absolutely no doubt that online gaming, especially during the COVID years, has gained a lot of patrons and a lot of attention, and no one knows what the true estimate is, but about almost $190 billion. Europe, online gaming has existed for many years. It's about 61% of all gaming, according to some sources. Asia, gross gaming revenue, it's not a majority, but it's a 14%, which is a huge chunk. The Philippines has become an online gaming center, not only here, but in the region. We'll talk about that a little more, but it's a major source of revenue for PAGCOR and the Philippine government. So the first thing I want to emphasize is there are two jurisdictional models. Europe, the US, the UK have developed, each of the countries has set up their own online gaming regulatory and systems, and that essentially competes with the other forms of online gaming at the present time. Malta and the Philippine model, essentially they permit licensees to offer online gaming outside of the Philippines, but to other countries. In fact, having a Philippine license or a Malta license they advertise that, they push that, that's why they exist essentially. And that's commonly known as the gray market or unregulated market. Based on everything we've seen, and I probably should have footnoted this, but basically 1/3 of the online gaming world is in the regulated world, and approximately 2/3 is in the gray area markets. So there's a lot of policy issues that, as online gaming operators or people involved in the industry, you don't have to deal with, but governments and the G7 countries and G20 countries have to address. There have been countries that have legislatively determined that online gaming is illegal in their country. That's a fact. Yet online gaming entities licensed in the Philippines, Malta, Gibraltar, Curacao, wherever, determine on their own, and of course in their own financial interest, that these countries are gray, and despite the illegality of them, the activity in that country, they offer their services. And why shouldn't they? So far, there's really been minimal consequences to that. There's been minimal enforcement at this point in time, although you're starting to see much more increased interest in enforcement. And that leads to the changing landscape. Countries that legalize online gaming on a state-by-state or jurisdictional basis, they're beginning to limit the online gaming to their jurisdictions. And why wouldn't they? Because the online gaming companies licensed in Malta don't pay taxes in their country. One of the reasons that states and jurisdictions are licensing online gaming is, among other reasons, for tax purposes, to get the tax revenue. There's geofencing going on now in the States and in Europe, whereby that aspect of it can be controlled. Companies like GeoComply and others are now trying to limit in the States, in Europe, in parts of the Caribbean, to just those countries. There is no doubt that law enforcement activities are going to increase, whether it be Interpol or whether it be the Financial Action Task Force based in Paris and other law enforcement agencies. This is one of the main topics going forward. Those jurisdictions that do it on a jurisdictional basis educate their consumers. Why go to an online company licensed in Malta when you can have the consumer protections in our country? You have a recourse. There's a licensing system. There's much more legitimacy to it. So they essentially seek to protect their licensees and obviously collect the online gaming tax, which can be, a ton of money. Now, right now, there's intense competition between legal online gaming and the gray approach. No one can stand here and tell you how it's ultimately going to turn out, but we're going to be seeing how this works out over the next 5 to 10 years. There's no doubt about it. Additional countries will consider legalized online gaming. In Asia, there are some countries like Japan, maybe Singapore, who will evaluate the jurisdictional approach. So the question will become, can legal online gaming compete with illegal or gray area online gaming? We think that within the next 5 years, the ratio of jurisdictional change will mean that about 2/3 of online gaming will be considered regulated, and 1/3 will probably stay in the gray area. That could change, that could accelerate, that might not be in 5 years, but that's the best guess of the people we're talking to. So again, the changing landscape, the Philippines, Gibraltar, Malta, we can throw in Curacao to that mix as well. Leading jurisdictions these are the leading jurisdictions that permit their licensees to offer online gaming in gray areas. Ironically, and probably as a consequence of that in part, the Philippines, Malta, and Gibraltar are on the gray list of money laundering countries and may get off that list, or they may graduate to the blacklist of money laundering countries. Failures to meet international standards are relating to licensing is one of the main issues, not raised by Spectrum, but raised by international law enforcement, the Financial Action Task Force. Compliance with suspicious transactions, training, and meaningful prosecutions at this time really hasn't taken place. But you can see what happened to the junkets in China. You can see what's happened with AML, with concerted law enforcement effort, and in the junket case, China's determination to crack down on the underground banking system. You can see what ultimately happens. The focus, there's going to be a tremendous focus in our belief by international law enforcement will be on jurisdictions that permit their licensees to offer services in the gray markets. And now, why is that the case? First and foremost, it's the licensing process. The toughest question to ask a junket, and we've asked this question in some of our investigations, is who owns the company? They can never and will never give you a straight answer on that. So the whole purpose of the licensing process is to determine where the direction and control of the company is and where the beneficial ownership is. Jurisdictions, that we've talked about who are in the gray area simply do not undertake the appropriate internationally accepted licensing investigations. Failures to adequately address know your customer, and now in Europe, the US, coming to Asia real soon, it's actually here, not only knowing your customer, but knowing your customer's source of wealth. Financial institutions are now demanding it, as are gaming regulators. I'm sure everybody here heard what happened about Crown and what's happening now with Star in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Perth. It's the same issues, basically. Who controls the company, AML, corporate governance, and in the case of the junkets, organized crime. There are still tremendous payment processing issues. The onboarding process by banks are becoming much more significant and serious. We see that all the time, and the Financial Action Task Force is now requiring the banks to be the first step in the process. And not to mention the Chinese government's position on online gaming. They stopped it in Cambodia. It's been an issue with the Philippines and the Chinese government, and it's going to be an issue with every country that seeks to go after Chinese gamblers in China. So licensing is absolutely critical, and I would suggest, if you have time, to look at the recent Financial Action Task Force report on the Philippines. Because Philippines has been put on the gray list since I think 2019, and recently was renewed on that list. So the Financial Action Task Force country reports, which are done by peer groups, and here in Asia, the peer group is the Asia Pacific Group based in Paris. They do all these peer group reviews in Asia. In the Caribbean, it's the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, and there's all these other regional organizations around the world that perform these peer group reviews. But the licensing is the critical step in the process. Doing a meaningful licensing process and having knowing a government before they issue a license who owns the company and where the control is critical. And online gaming, along with casino gaming, has been identified, to the shock of no one, as high risk by the Financial Action Task Force. That's the fundamental, one of the most significant high risk areas in all of these financial transactions. I'm going to move quickly so we have time for questions. Maybe I should move slowly so there's no time for questions, but we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Now, there's no question the Philippines has done a tremendous job. Entertainment city with the casinos, the development of casinos in Cebu and around the rest of the country, tremendous upside potential. But as I noted, the Philippines was placed on the gray list of money laundering countries back in 2019, and I think they recently renewed that. There are three basic agencies responsible for money laundering, anti-money laundering issues in the Philippines. The AMLC is the equivalent of the Financial Intelligence Unit for the Philippines. Every country has a Financial Intelligence Unit. It's AMLC here. And this is the only agency in the Philippines that has the authority to investigate money laundering offenses. The central bank's involved in this as well for the filing of the suspicious transaction reports. And I just summarized here some of the conclusions in the recent report on the Philippines. The AMLC has received a low number of currency transaction reports from casinos and a low number of cross-border currency declarations. That's clearly out of whack with the risk factors that are in place in the Philippines. So that's a huge red flag. The Philippines has not yet demonstrated an effective implementation of the risk-based system approach that's used by every country in the world, and they have to step up their act. Casinos in Entertainment City are making progress, but additional steps have to be taken, and they relate to junkets. The Philippine government recently announced that the casinos will be responsible for doing the background investigations of junkets, if they have any anymore. But that's going to get you nowhere, because the licensing process is a governmental function. You can't rely on the casinos to do that because they don't have access to intelligence information, they don't have access to law enforcement information. That's clearly a governmental function, and that's not going to get the Philippines off the gray list. PAGCOR is the third agency here, and everybody knows PAGCOR. They're responsible for implementing the risk-based system for gaming, including online gaming. So FATA has concluded that the banking and gaming sectors here are at risk for the transfer of illegal proceeds in and out of the country. No one in this room can be shocked by that. But that's tells you how the international community is viewing the situation. So the Chinese markets are available and always have been to the Philippines, especially in the online gaming through the POGOs. Yet today, the Chinese market is off limits. That doesn't mean some of the online companies here are not trying to go into that market. Many companies licensed by PAGCOR in online gaming circumvent the prohibitions in China. And let me be perfectly clear, and we've been talking about the junket issue since Macau reverted back to China, and we've been involved in some of these issues. This is not going to end well. Just ask the people sitting in jail in Macau now, and ask the casinos in Macau how they're doing on their VIP junket business. Jurisdictions where online gaming is legal, there's going to be a direct competition between the POGO licensees and licensed online gaming companies. So the risks of prosecution and reputational damage exist. There's going to be more prosecutions in the next 5 years as countries and jurisdictions and states legalize online gaming and want to protect that income for themselves. So the online gaming sector, obviously, people make choices, companies make choices. They're free to make any choice they want. But online gaming sector needs to do better. Countries on the gray list need to go forward to get off the gray list, or they're going to be placed on the blacklist by the Financial Action Task Force. And when Laos was on the blacklist of money laundering countries, Cambodia's been on that list. We were hired to get Laos off the blacklist of money laundering countries, and it took a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that. Now that they've gotten off, we'll see how they do going forward. But I think the online gaming industry has to be preparing for aggressive action by other jurisdictions seeking to limit online gaming where it is illegal. That these things have started, and it's going to continue. The VPNs are, clearly a way to circumvent this. The junkets were master of circumventions for decades until they were not. And history has a way of repeating itself. So the open questions are basically the current law enforcement landscape is changing. Interpol's international enforcement of illegal gaming with member countries is going to obviously increase. The laws in countries deeming gaming illegal and the level of enforcement is highly likely to increase. There'll be competition with countries legalizing online gaming, again, with those jurisdictions where online gaming is not legalized in that country. We suspect that there'll be aggressive prosecutions going forward, not only in Europe, but in the US, and when countries out here license online gaming, they'll obviously take a more aggressive approach. So we have about 9 minutes left. And happy to answer any questions to the extent we can.
So as you said that in Cambodia is in the gray list right now, and also as you know that the online gaming is illegal there. So I want to know your thoughts on that, and also if you think that there's going to be future opportunities about that we consider about the online gaming in the future. Maybe your thoughts on that.
Which jurisdiction again?
Yeah.
Which country? Which?
Cambodia.
Oh, Cambodia.
Yeah.
Well, they've been on the gray list and everything for off and on for years, not only with the casinos, but you saw what happened in Sihanoukville. China basically closed all those places down. I mean, my view is if you go back to the history of Las Vegas, it's the history of organized crime. And they were able to get their act together starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and cleaned up their act. It ultimately always depends on governmental will, okay? And so far the Cambodian government hasn't demonstrated a lot of governmental will, but if that changes one way or another, then things could change positively for sure. But governmental will is the critical variable in all of these things.
In the crypto world, we know there's a number of operators, big names. Couldn't possibly name them, but big. No, there's a number of names that we know still accept US players. Indirectly, officially they say they don't. Have you heard anything of if Uncle Sam is having an eye on those crypto bros who are obviously illegally taking bets?
If I did, I wouldn't tell you.
But are they on the radar already?
It's a legitimate issue, and cryptocurrency is another red flag because it has part of the reason why it was established was to protect the anonymity of the people doing it. So that automatically creates a conflict with the AML laws in any particular country, whether it be the US, whether it be Europe. My personal view is digital currency is going to become the norm in perhaps 10 years. That's going to happen, but it's going to be done through the countries and no one is going to say all the progress that's been made on AML over the last 30 years is going to be thrown away for that. It's going to be part of the process.
My question becomes, when you have a mix of owners, so you have Jason Ader at 26 Capital, hedge fund guy out of Miami who owns parts of Okada. So what if Okada then has an issue with AML, money laundering, junkets?
Right.
What happens to a guy like Jason Ader out of the US?
I mean, some jurisdictions are considering licensing online gaming through their legalized casinos, which would give an extra element of control. That's happened in some of the European jurisdictions. It's happened in the US jurisdictions. It's being considered by some other jurisdictions. So it's one regulator usually for online gaming and casinos. And it's usually the same licensing standards for online gaming and casinos. Lotteries are now involved in this with sports betting as well. So the standards are essentially uniform. So if you do one thing in one jurisdiction or different forms of gaming, ultimately it's going to be the same accountability.
Here.
Oh, there.
Hello. So you said the crypto going to be the norm. Is it meaning that all the currency in the world would disappear? And
Say that again, I didn't.
you said that the crypto going to be the norm, in the next 10, maybe 8 years. Meaning, is it the other currency will disappear and all the casino will going to be regulated because at the end the crypto is not cash and is tracked or not?
I don't know if it's all going to disappear. I don't think, things are changing in the gaming industry, but companies will make choices. Some companies presently in the broader gray area may choose to get licensed in some companies, and there'll be changes taking place. Some countries may give them a grandfather clause in so that they're not punished for their previous activities from a governmental perspective. There's a lot of permutations and combinations that could take place. And governments are going to be creative because they want the tax money. They want to keep it within their jurisdiction. And there'll probably always be a gray market. I don't think it's going to disappear 100%, but it's going to be under increasing pressure.
I mean, the crypto would be a perfect solution to that because basically with all that...
legitimate crypto.
Absolutely, legitimate crypto, because with all that, let's say countries could then start demanding, even from gray market operators, their, pound of flesh. My question is really very simple, and I want to hear your answer. I have my own interpretations. Everybody has heard about it. Hardcore, what's the difference between gray and black?
Well, that's a good question. It depends how you interpret it, and it's open to a lot of interpretations. Some people are, instead of calling it gray and black now, are calling it underregulated and unregulated. There was a recent study, I don't know if you saw it, from the Hong Kong Jockey Club, that one where they used that terminology. Whatever terminology you use, it's the same basic concepts. Gray might be underregulated and black might be no regulation. So it depends, and that's going to have to, New Jersey, for example, they will allow their licensees or the parent companies to do business in gray areas as long as it's not illegal in those jurisdictions and as long as there's an enforcement mechanism. So there's a lot of permutations there that will have to be sorted out going forward. We're at the beginning. This is like 1998 in Macau. So we'll see how it all sorts itself out.
Thank you, Frank, for interesting discussion on compliance. On that topic, I'd like to ask, who actually prosecutes when there is a compliance break? If you target a country where the residents are not allowed to partake in gambling, is it the host country where you're breaking the rules, or is it the regulator where you're supposed to be based?
Well, it could be both at some point. If the Philippines stepped up their compliance, theoretically it could be the Philippines, but more likely it's going to be the jurisdiction. There's something called extradition, and all these countries have extradition treaties. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but theoretically, and depending on how aggressive the prosecutors want to be, they would have the ability to extradite. It hasn't happened yet. It may not happen, but it's more likely that it will happen.